Hello and welcome to the Lord's Brewing Co. YouTube channel. I thought the music would kind of fade out, but it didn't. It just cut us off and threw us on. Hello, I'm John from Lord's Brewing Company. This is Jess from Singlecast Nation, and we have Matt from Brew Cavern. And we're going to try. In fact, I also have somebody in the basement. Let's bring him on. Hello.
How do? My name's Steve Montgomery. I'm from the Scottish Hospitality Group, and I also run my own restaurant here in the lovely part of Dumfries and Galloway. So,
wow, this is fantastic. This is perfect. This is what I was looking for. So, we've all joined together for this live stream. It's been kind of a bit of a last minute idea, but my thought was to bring us all together from different parts of the trade. We're all affected by this DRS scheme, but there's very little information about what it is. And I think the general public don't have a clue really what it is either and why we're all moaning about it. And it's making us look bad because we're all moaning and it's under the banner of recycling. I think this pushes us into our first question, which is, if I can find the overlay, I'm very professional, which is, there we go, overlay one. Is a deposit return scheme a bad idea? Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to jump in there. No, I don't think so. I think there's clearly some issues globally with recycling rates and public incentive to kind of recycle. So yeah, I think in principle it's a scheme that's needed, and in other countries, it does work well. But I mean, we'll probably get onto this, but it just feels that the implementation so far of this scheme, and we're talking about one small part of the United Kingdom, is not been great. And this is, potentially the the benchmark for what then happens with the rest of the country. So yeah, no. In short answer, not a bad idea, but there's a lot of reasons why we're not happy with the way it's been implemented so far.
Anybody else?
I was going to say pretty much exactly the same as Matt's sentiments. I feel like the short answer is yes, with then like a big fat asterisk and then a whole long list of explanations as to why yes is a context-laden answer. But the principle of it is, and everybody that I've spoken to in the producing side of this, nobody's objecting to the idea of encouraging more recycling and being greener. So far so good, I think, for us.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you just said there. I mean, and nobody is against the deposit return scheme. We see it throughout the world. I think it's just we're against this scheme in its current format because, and I've had several meetings this morning on this already, and up to the final hour of midnight last night, there were still people who were like, "Will I register? Will I not?" And I'm obviously from hospitality side of things, and our registration just went live about an hour ago, and the terms and conditions that we've got that's just come up I haven't even had a chance to read through them, but I think where the UK Internal Markets Act comes in is going to be an issue as well, because if it does come through from the Secretary of State that this is an issue, it's who's telling lies here, because right the way through the minister for this has said that yes, it's been applied for. Yes, it's been applied for. Well, actually, it hasn't, and we put in an FOI to request information as to when it was applied for. And I know that John Swinney had applied in January for some issues, some stuff relating to it, but it wasn't actually a request directly for DRS. It was on the single-use plastics and stuff like that. So, if it does get kiboshed and shelved to a degree, it has financial implications for everybody, that have invested into it. So it's a political hot potato at the minute, because you've got the current running for, without getting into politics of it, you've got 3 MSPs running for the First Minister's position here, who all have different ideas on where we stand with DRS. One is saying take small producers out of it for a year. and the other two are saying, well, let's just shelve it and rethink it. And Kate Forbes' attitude of, pause it, rethink it, talk more industry, is going to have devastating effects is quite clearly the absolute reason for the shelve it. And being finance secretary, she's got a good steer on where this was going to hit the industry, and has come out and said it. So it's at the point now where registration for hospitality, people are looking at it and going, we'll see where we were and the debacle that's been happening for our small producers or anybody producers. And now we're sitting facing this. Do we even bother? Because if we put our time and labour costs into registration and looking through the T's and C's for eventually it to be absolutely shelved anyway, it's a waste of labour.
Absolutely. I mean, I think my personal view is I love the idea of recycling. I'm all for. I mean, I'd be well up for bottles not getting crushed, but actually getting cleaned, delabeled and cleaned, and I'd buy those back on a pallet, no problem. I'd be quite happy to buy re-cleaned and sterilised bottles. I love that idea. I would move from cans if that was a thing. The cans, great, recycled cans, all that is fine. It's a great idea. There's the rest of the world seems to be able to do it. I went to Mexico, and our driver, when we were out there, stopped and took his bottles of Corona back to the depot, got some money, jumped back in the van, and off we went. It's a normal thing. So I just think this is, it's so politicized that it's a good idea that has become a tool for politics.
Yeah, and unfortunately, as you can see, is what's happening here in Scotland with the tie-in at the same time of we're going through the process of getting a new First Minister and all the stuff that has come out, which I'm sure we will unfortunately have to discuss in a bit. All the kind of political twists that have happened when we were discussing this. It's very hard not to make it political. I have tried to make it about the scheme and how it will affect, me as a producer, rather than the politics on it. But unfortunately, there comes a point where you can't get past, the idea of a badly made scheme, and it becomes about the politicians who are involved in it, as Stephen's already named several.
Exactly. Right. It takes us to our next question.
Just before we go on there, John, there is a statement coming out this afternoon, about 3:25, 3:30 from the Minister, Lorna Slater. So it'll be interesting. So I would watch that one to see what comes. And then there is also business motions later on in the evening as well, about 5 o'clock, I think it is. So so if you get tuned into Scottish Parliament TV, you'll be able to watch it and grab your popcorn.
Indeed, I will be watching it for sure. Okay, so the next question. So there's a lot of people that have no idea what this scheme is or how it works. And really, we're going to break this up into a few questions. So how does this system work for the consumer and the business? Jess, you did a fantastic job of explaining it. But do you reckon you can make it even smaller?
An even more condensed version.
Yeah, just for those watching. And I'm sorry, chat, I haven't put any of your questions up yet. I will do, and there'll be an opportunity to ask the panel any questions that you have. We're just trying to lay everything out now. So Jess, go for it. Take the floor.
Okay, so the really high speed version of this that I did yesterday, and I'll do a little quick plug here. If you want to go check out my longer with lots more words version, we're on here on YouTube under One Nation Under Whiskey, and it's our latest extra episode where I tried to walk everybody through it as best as I could without getting too distracted. But the short version, as a producer, so that's me, I am an independent bottler of spirits here in Scotland, in sunny Glasgow today. What we do is we bottle whiskies and other spirits, but a producer could also be someone like John, who is a brewery, or there's a few kind of other little add-ins who count as producers, but we'll not get too bogged down in them. So basically, in theory, I should either register with SEPA if I want to do all of the administrative stuff myself, and that's the Scottish Environmental Agency, or we can use this newly created business called Circularity Scotland, who are very controversial, and again, I'm sure we will come to them. Basically, I was supposed to sign up, the deadline was midnight last night, to a 40-page producer agreement, which was still in the motions of being changed over the weekend. but it's a legally binding document that holds me accountable to Circularity Scotland to a number of regulations. But basically, the principle is that once you're registered with them or SEPA, you have to register all of your products. So in the trade, we know them as SKUs. So every product is registered on the system, uploaded with a barcode. And that's how they're going to track when our products are put out into the wild, how it's coming back in, is because when you return an item, it's going to get scanned. And that will activate the 20p return. But up front, I am supposed to sell Circularity Scotland, how many units I'm going to sell in Scotland. And then they will basically make me pay for that number times 20p's. And over the last week and a half, there's been a kind of sliding movement as to when I will have to pay those, because as a small producer, they're now saying that's unfair compared to maybe my neighbours' tenants here in Glasgow who are producing millions of products, who have a slightly more generous cash flow than I do. And so it's about where that money comes from. And then as those items are returned, 20p's are deposited back to me, because the scan will say a bottle of Single Cask Nation has been returned. And in the end of every accounting period, those 20p's technically come back to me through a slightly convoluted system. So that's the really short version. Is I'm charged for the 20p's going out. And then as the lovely customers who buy my products drink them and return them, those 20p's are credited back to me. There are a whole stack of wrinkles along the way. But to a consumer, I think maybe there's a lot of people talking about in previous years gone by, where here in Glasgow, obviously very famously, people drink Irn-Bru, and you would drink your brew, your ginger, and you take it back to the shop and you get your 20p. And it was 20p even in the 90s, as my bosses pointed out yesterday. And that was it. That's slightly different, and we can take a little pause here. That's what's called closed circuit recycling. So that's exactly what you were talking about. And they do it in Germany with standardized beer bottles, and they go directly back to the brewery. What we're looking at here is not like that. So all that glass is taken to a central point, and it'll be crushed and then resold it, which means there's more recycled material available to buy if you're a glass producer. And again, I'm sure we can argue whether or not we think that's more or less green than what happens now. So as a consumer, it doesn't really look any different. You're going to be charged a stack of 20p's across a whole load of products that you buy, you know, cans of juice, it's going to be bottles of wine, it's going to be bottles of nice whiskies, maybe from me, you know. And so eventually the point is you'll take it back to, and I'm sure Matt will have to deal with it, the number of different outlets to get your 20p's back. So that might be going to a shop like Matt, it might be going to what they're calling a reverse vending machine, which I find really hard to say, and getting that back in a supermarket. So yeah, as a consumer, maybe not that different on the face of it, how it looks in other countries. It certainly doesn't look too different to when you're on holiday in Germany, or I go to Sweden a lot. It doesn't look that different to that. But Scotland are trying to create a far more progressive program. So we're trying to run really before we've actually even walked. We're including a whole stack of recyclables. Like in Sweden, when they brought it in, they focused on aluminium, and 10 years later introduced plastic. People like Germany don't include wine, spirits, and milk in their recycling circuits. So, but in Scotland, we're going for an all-encompassing recycle all the things, is my cynical short version of it. And then we can dissect how that goes.
Okay. Thank you, Jess. Matt, question. Now, it was interesting when you chatted with me on text, what you said. I never considered how it would affect you guys. So as a retailer, please, what does this system mean for you?
So we're based in Nottingham, in the Midlands in England. So a layman might look at this and go, well, how does this affect you? You know, you're talking about a system that's being bought in Scotland. Probably around 10% of our sales are into Scotland. And it's quite telling, actually, because when you watch Lorna Slater on the little sound bites online talking, you know, in Scottish Parliament about the scheme, she only ever talks about Scottish businesses. But the fact of the matter is, if you're selling into Scotland, you still have to abide by the scheme. So what are we to do in that instance? Because we've got customers all over the country. To rebuild our website so that a Scottish customer can see that there's a 20p deposit being applied to every item they buy is time consuming, expensive, actually probably not even that easy from a development point of view. And also, if you're a casual browser of that website, you wouldn't necessarily be logged in, so you wouldn't see these different prices until you do so, and that might come as a shock that every item has now gone up 20p. Also, we import beer ourselves from the United States, and my understanding of the scheme is that we would have to register as a producer, because technically that's just how it works. Like you're not asking all these American breweries to sign up to the scheme. You're acting essentially as the producer. We handle the import, and then we have to register all those products on the scheme. A lot of these American breweries, they have different rules over there, different laws. They don't apply barcodes on cans. It's just not something they do often. So what are we to do then? Are we supposed to put our own little barcode on there? Which, as I was chatting to you yesterday, John, kind of sprung to me that anyone could do that. Anyone could print their own label and gather a load of cans and register them on the scheme and collect a load of cans and make a load of money off the back of this. So that's one small part of what I just think they've, in the grand scheme of things, they've not thought through. Now, the other thing I don't really understand at this point in time is what we have to do in terms of being a return point, given that we're in England. Perhaps some other people have some answers on that, but like a lot of the questions that seem to be raised directly to Lorna Slater or otherwise, the reply is often, we don't know, but we will do. So you're asking people to sign up to a legally binding scheme that they don't have all the answers to. You wouldn't sign a new mobile phone contract or a lease or any other legally binding document without having all the answers to all your questions. So it's no wonder that there's people that still haven't registered. And yeah, for many reasons, it's just chaotic. And yeah, you've got people saying, well, we just won't stand into Scotland anymore. You've got people saying we just won't register and we'll see what happens. And when they catch up with us, they catch up with us and we'll deal with it then. We haven't registered because we just didn't have the answers to the questions that we needed. But, there's a bit of fence sitting going on, I think, for a lot of people at the moment about what the best next steps forward are. And I think given how how messy and kind of political it's got over the last few days, presumably that's the right decision. But like you say, there's people that have already invested quite a bit of money and time in getting ready for a scheme that may or may not continue in some form or another. So yeah, it's messy.
Thank you, Matt. That I did. There's stuff there that I never even considered. I'm still amazed that they would expect you to be a producer, because then that falls into all sorts of other problems with licensing as a brewery, and then where does it stop? Steve, tell me, hospitality. How does it affect you guys?
Okay, so hospitality will be working on what they call a closed loop. So what will happen is when Jess as a producer or Matt as a producer sells it to wholesale, and then we buy it as a retail or as hospitality business from wholesale, we will pay 20 pence on the top of every single unit that we buy. So if it's a case of 24 bottles of Jess's lovely whiskey or whatever, that's 24 times 20 pence. So we pay that to the wholesaler, which means then that the wholesaler becomes cost neutral, if I'm right. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Jess. So that's the way that works. So all those 20 pences sit on our P&L or on our books as being cash spent. We then, so if you, John, come into my restaurant and order a bottle of wine or a glass of cola, whatever the case may be, we do not charge you as a consumer the 20 pence. All right. So we get that 20 pence back whenever we get your glass bottle in or your PET or whatever it is. We then, at the moment, as it stands, have to return everything to CSL, which are being collected by Biffa. Now, the only contract that has been given the rights to lift, which is another controversial topic. However, what happens then is we have to separate glass into glass bottle bins, which will be supplied by Biffa. We then have to separate the PET or plastic bottles and aluminium cans into plastic bags, which then have to be bagged and tagged, which have to be bought through a recognised dealer. These tags then get scanned, etc., and sent back to the recycling depot. As it stands just now, the way that the IT systems in CSL will work is that we will have to take a CSV file from our EPOS systems, our till systems, download that, send that back to CSL's IT system. That will then reconcile with what we sent back to the recycling depot through Biffa. and then they say within 7 days, and good luck with that, that you get your 20 pences back. All right. So there's a cash flow issue there to start with. However, where it gets really complicated is, say, for example, late night economy, nightclubs, etc. And I'll use Glasgow as a typical example, where they're not allowed to use glass, etc. after midnight or 10 o'clock. And it's actually in some of their licenses that they're not allowed to lose it or to use it per se. So try and tell 600, 700, 800 people on a Saturday night that they're not allowed to crush a can, because crushed cans cannot be redeemable for 20 pences. So a lot of these nightclubs already crush their cans at the end of the night to save space, because space is key in many of our venues for storage. And then they go back into their normal recycling contracts they already have with third-party recycling, whatever the case may be. Those cans will now be lost. So all the 20p's that we haven't charged but already paid will be lost, because the cans have been already crushed by the consumer. So the answer to that, and the only answer just at the moment, is that we have to then charge the consumer at least 20 pence on top of the product, because we're not going to get those 20 pences back.
Well, and then you've got the VAT.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, don't even start with that one. So those 20 pences, right? That comes off your bottom, because you're not getting them back. So what you're going to do, you're not going to sign up to this agreement with DRS, because all those aluminium cans are just going to go into your normal recycling bin that you already use. So the actual reason that we're recycling just gets lost, because you're not going to return them. So the fact that you're going to send 20 pence and the other thing about it is, the consumer does not understand that this isn't about 20 pences. So you've got 20 pence for the deposit. You've got Jess and Matt's and yourself, your admin cost, your remarketing and rebranding on your cans or your bottles, etc. All the admin that goes into it. That then works its way itself down into the product per can or per bottle, whatever the case may be. Some people are talking anything between, including the deposit, 29 pence to 50 pence a item on top of the cost. So when you go into, I don't know, a pub or a supermarket, whatever the case is, on the 17th of August, when this goes live on the 16th, go in to buy your weekly shop, these things are going to be, a case 24 is going to be a minimum of £4.80 more. So you're probably looking at about £6.80 thereabouts, I think, some people. £7. But where it gets more complicated is the UK wide barcode, correct me if I'm wrong here, but UK wide barcode versus a Scotland only barcode. So with us, particularly down around the borders, we already see white van loads coming down from Central Belt down to Carlisle, for near I am, because of the minimum unit pricing. So you can buy, I don't know, 4 cases for the price of 3 or 2, whatever it is in England, but you can't do it in Scotland. They go back up in. If a consumer is able to recognize the difference in the barcodes, they could quite easily buy all their stock in Carlisle or anywhere across the borders, bring those back in if it's a UK wide barcode, and claim their 20 pences back. At the moment, there is nothing to stop that. So if a consumer is, even around here, I'm only 15 minutes to Carlisle, so they decide that, well, actually, it's more beneficial for me to go south of the border to buy my DRS-free products. They're not just going to buy their DRS-free products, they're going to buy their household shop at the same time. So therefore, our supermarkets and our butchers, our vegetable suppliers, everything in the small towns and villages that rely on local footfall, that gets lost. So it's wider than just, a small issue of what's only 20 pence. So
I had read yesterday somewhere, and I've read so much over the last week, I can no longer remember all my sources unless I write them down as I go. I think they've budgeted for £120 million worth of fraudulent claims on deposits, which equates to something mental like 57,000 a week, purely on what you're talking about, Steve, about the idea of kind of people catching on to it. And when we discussed it yesterday and we were talking about it, we were really only thinking on one person getting like a little one-up out of it on the system and thinking, well, I can get a cheeky 180 here. But exactly what you're talking about, we can be doing whole van loads here. And that's one of the things they have looked at, and they are talking about penalizing producers. And this is kind of gray area because they changed their minds halfway through saying it, but they were talking about penalizing producers who use UK-wide barcodes. The initial conversation was everybody who is a producer in Scotland needs to change to Scottish barcodes, and then non-Scottish barcodes effectively, because I export too. So But I am a really small scale, so I'm working with single casks of whiskey. So we may only be talking about 300 bottles out of a cask. So then I'd have to be doing the maths. How many of those stay in Scotland versus all like going out? So a conclusion was kind of sort of from my last check on it was that if you were using a UK-wide barcode or one barcode for your whole SKU of that product, you would be penalized in that there'd be an extra charge levied on me as a producer to counteract the increase of fraud that my business doing this is posing. So I'm either going to get charged for having to produce extra labels and registering extra barcodes and making sure that that stock is separated, or I'm being charged across the board because that is too onerous for my very tiny business. So we just have one barcode for that whole cask effectively, because each cask gets a new barcode because it's a new product. So yeah, the producers are being taxed at both ends, and your point's entirely right about the numbers adding up. Like, I can't afford for it to come out of my margin. So unfortunately, that means the consumer is the person who's going to end up paying it along with a deposit. And that, 50p on a bottle of whiskey, well, it's not great, but it's not the end of the world. But if you're a brewer like John, 50p, 70p on a can or a bottle of beer suddenly starts adding up really quickly. And in a very competitive world, when you've got beers in supermarkets, that's a huge difference as to where your product sits on a shelf before we even get to the idea of it being an English brewery coming into Scotland.
Well, this is where also the whole label debacle is a joke, really. Matt, you see how cans come in, so you'll deal with loads and loads of beer cans. So there's some that are printed on a can, so they actually print and paint the can. So that means potentially you've got two lots for that. You might have, like we have polyvinyl chloride labels. That would mean that we'd have to have two designs. And also, this is an interesting thing, there is a legal requirement. The consumer doesn't necessarily know this. There is a legal requirement of what we have to put on that label, how we space it, all that kind of stuff. There's no legislation for that. So they've said, we'd like a barcode, but then they talked about maybe a sticker. But there's no like where you can put that or how you can do it. So there's no guidelines on that at all. We don't even know. Those labels, I can't buy 100 labels because I don't sell a massive amount into Scotland, but they do buy beer from me in Scotland. So I can't justify I would buy a roll of beer bottle labels. The minimum quantity would be about 1,500 labels. And that would be somewhere in the region of 300 quid all in per roll. So you're adding another £300 to a potential that there's not that much margin in them anyway. To then add a £600 label bill for potentially, and you can say, well, you just keep selling that bottle of beer until you run out of labels, but it doesn't work like that because your consumer gets bored. They want the next new thing that you've produced, and so you're just going to be wasting whole reams of labels and all that kind of stuff. Then on top of that, the supermarket is a really, Jess, as you said it, I was thinking, hang on a minute. Most people don't realise that when independent breweries sell to supermarkets, we make I haven't sold to them, so I just like to put that out there, but the average is between 5 and 20. Like if you got 20 pence a can, you are rocking it. But it's normally between 5 and 10 pence profit a can. So if you are then asked to put 20p to that, or even have a second set of barcodes, you've lost your profit. It's gone.
Yeah. And there's two really good little comments that have come in here. One asking about, is my stock allocated before it goes to Scotland? So to do with the labels. I try and allocate as much of my stock when I have a release because it means I get to manage cash flow a little easier. But I always have like a residual stock that I keep because I want to work with small producers here in Scotland, or maybe I want to use for events. So generally I don't sell my entire allocation of a release. So again, then I've got this kind of like portion of stock that's floating around. Is it, going to Scotland? Is it going to England? Is it going all over the world? And so, that's really hard for me to do the maths for that as a small producer. I can't imagine once you start scaling them up, what that looks like. And the other one was here saying, I collect labels from beers I've enjoyed. I live north of the border, I wouldn't be able to. Yeah, you wouldn't. And I have the same problem as a whiskey drinker. that sometimes when I really love a bottle of whiskey, I don't have an infinite sized house. So I'll take a label and keep it. I've got a little notebook of them, which is very nerdy. And I've done the same with beer cans. I have no shame. This is a, fairly nerd orientated occupation. And yeah, so that would mean that the bottle can't be recycled, which again means that I'm costing, if it's my own product, I'm costing myself 20p plus a VAT to keep a label. There's so much of this that has not been thought about, and they haven't even decided, when Steve was talking about crushed cans, they haven't even decided how crushed a can can be before it can no longer be scanned. I imagine that would be too crushed.
That's the point I was about to make, actually, because we get all kinds of condition of products arriving to us. Some very crushed and almost unsellable, and some that would just about pass, and some that even have like a manufacturing defect where the canning line has hit it in exactly the same place on every single can in 4 cases of beer. And customers will go, "Oh, can I get one that isn't dented?" It's like, if you can find one, yeah. But does that not qualify as being in uncrushed condition? Where do you draw the line on that? Yeah, and on the label thing, I mean, yeah, like I say, we're still very unclear about what that means as an importer and what we're supposed to put on the cans. If we're going to go to our American counterparts and say, "Look, we can't get our head around this. Can you produce some new labels for the UK market?" And they're just going to go, "No."
Yeah,
No way.
I think the idea of the stickers as well, there was conversation about maybe for producers who, I mean, all of my products have barcodes, but not everybody in the industry does have barcodes. I can name several independent bottlers who don't use them. So there had been a conversation about getting like a roll of stickers that would look like the UK duty stamp. So those red kind of thumbprint that you see on spirits bottles.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of very complicated and rightfully so legislation about at what point you can label things. Because at the moment it's to do with, it shows that your money to the revenue for tax on excise and VAT has been paid. So those stickers, when I apply them to my bottles, have to be done in a bonded warehouse under supervision. Technically, somebody from the Treasury can turn up and watch my bottling hall have that done. And you're not allowed to destroy those without somebody from the revenue being there to supervise it, to avoid any ideas of you getting around paying VAT and kind of making it a bit squidgy. So I wonder if that would be covered in the same way. If we create a roll of labels that allow for DRS returns, I don't think that you would be, Matt, be allowed to be applying those at the till point in your shop, being like, well, so what point do they get applied? There's also no conversation about how much they will cost, because I can't imagine they're free, because duty stamps are not free. So there's that. I assume when you import, as a slightly technical question, I assume when you import these American beers, you get notified, you pay the taxes, and then they're delivered to you. You're not keeping them under bond in a warehouse somewhere.
No.
So there is nowhere for these goods to have the stamps applied to them before they get to your shop. So they're relying on you being a very honest shopkeeper and not being like to your mate, here's a thing with 5 extra stickers on the side. You being very diligently only applying 1 sticker to genuinely returnable objects. The more I think about this, the more my mind implodes. And we still need to find a way of communicating this to the people in the shop to explain why everything now costs more, and it's going to cost significantly more than the 20p that they're anticipating getting back at the end of it.
Yeah.
Just looking at Jamie.
Just quite quick, one very. Oh, sorry. Gosh, I'm lagging out here. Sorry. That we've just had a press release from CSL. So what I'll do, we could go through it, but I think it would be very boring. But yeah, it's just come out. So we have a press release already. I don't know whether it's going to be worth even reading.
It doesn't tell you. I bet you, John, it doesn't tell you many people have signed up.
What's it say?
Does it have a number? Because Lana Slater still couldn't tell you on Monday how many people had signed up to the scheme. And I think it's not because she couldn't, because that's a very easy thing for Circularity Scotland to be able to look into their system and see how many registered users are there. I think it's that out of the, 4,500 people they're expecting to register. There's a figure rumoring that there's something like 600 businesses have registered.
Mm-hmm.
Just looking at Jimmy comment on there, listening to your comments, it all seems very ill thought out. Absolutely. And I think that's all about, consultation. It's a bit like, when you go back to the UK internal market thing, when you think, right, okay, it's a bit, if you have, that should be your baseline for actually starting this whole thing. If you can't get that, the whole thing's a kibosh. It'd be a bit like me buying a hotel or a restaurant or a pub without a license and just hoping I'm going to get it. And we sent out a letter to every single MSP right the way across Scotland about DRS, and some of the comments that come back from some politicians was just horrendous because of the lack of knowledge. But this we were talking about earlier on in barcodes and things like that. That actually shows why we asked for a pause and to join the UK-wide system in 2025, because it would just stop the fraud. It would stop the issues of extra costs to small businesses. The whole lot would just be so much simpler. And everybody says, well, why not? Germany have done it, Finland done it, all these different places have done it, but they haven't done it the same way we have. We just, as Jess says, went right slap bang, right into it, all on, full on, right in the middle of the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh. It's horrendous. Absolutely horrendous.
Yeah, I think it also helps to create like a weird amount of uncertainty. Like even here in the chats, we've got Gary saying he's a brewer distiller in Southwest England. Is he going to have to start treating Scotland like an export? Yeah, and worse, because when I export my goods to literally all over the world, I'm not busy haranguing them to have the bottles or the containers sent back or proof that they've been recycled, because it financially does affect my business. Whereas you being south of the border from me, you are going to have to ensure that it's been handled and put back so you can get your 20p's in the ambitious 7-day turnaround time. I'm really worried by this lovely thing that you've just put up. That's the first line makes me want to scream and shut all of it down, which is Scotland's deposit return scheme on course for August launch.
It's insane, isn't it? More than what was that? More than 650 large, small, and medium-sized producers signed up.
That's an embarrassing small number.
650. That's nothing. That's nothing. That's no one.
I think between the four of us, you could probably come up with 650 producers.
This is
easily.
painful.
We probably, over the course of the 9 years that we've been in business, I think we've probably stocked beer, cider, and wine from over 1,000 different producers. So it's a pretty appalling number if the figure in mind was 4,500. Just to go back to Gary's point, you need to treat it like export, but it almost kind of hammers home that point that Carlisle and the surrounding border towns are going to become like the Wild West for people ultimately cheating the scheme. Like, because if you're expecting producers to put the same label on their product regardless of where it's being sold, England, Wales, Europe, wherever, then what's to stop people buying it in England and Wales, and perhaps they're taking a trip up to Scotland anyway and just chancing it, and they're going to claim their deposit back at the nearest return point. Maybe they turn that into a business in itself. It's the whole thing is just bonkers.
There's also the idea of you're talking about products coming back up, but what about the lost article schemes, which is the technical term for a thing that contains liquid? I obviously, working in the whiskey industry, we have a lot of tourists that come to Scotland and they want to take home a bottle with them. Now am I going to have to say to them oh, sorry lads, could you drink it before you get on the plane, because I kind of need that 20p back actually, thanks. I don't think it's worth underestimating. I have a huge amount of international friends, not to brag, who come to Scotland and take whiskies home with them. All of them are genuinely filling their suitcases with whiskey. That's hundreds sometimes per person over the course of a couple of years of returns that will never make it back across the border. So I don't see how you can counter against that. And then this idea that maybe people are going to set up white van businesses running potentially dodgy scheme articles back up north.
I'm sure those people are probably the most prepared for this scheme, because why wouldn't you? I think the other point as well really is that the reason a scheme that's designed for Scotland and Scotland only can't work in a nation like the United Kingdom is because for this very reason the borders are open. Like you're asking people to apply strict rules to an area that's a theoretical border. There's no checks going through there, like you would get going to other countries. The other point really that's kind of just sprung to mind from recent conversation is the cost implications. Although people talk about it's only 20p, and then we actually, as Steve was saying, it's actually the wider cost of the admin and the administration costs that come, the application costs that come with signing up to the scheme, and producing new labels and everything that comes with that. It's the same regardless of the size of the business. So your macro brewers and your massive wholesalers, to a certain extent, can probably swallow quite a lot of that cost.
Yeah, and they've mentioned that a lot in the. There's been a lot of talk because there's a real problem, it seems, to define who a small producer is. I'm very clearly a small producer. There's 3 of us, and 2 of us are in the US, so that's not hard to work out how big a company I'm running. But I think it's ludicrous. At this point, the costs are becoming arbitrary. You have to pay them whatever. But I think it's ludicrous that I'm paying the producer fee of £365, and my neighbour's tenants are paying £365. I mean, that's not even a number for them to think about. That's like go away. £365 is not the world's biggest sum of money for me either, but it is an added consideration when that's an annual fee that I'm going to have to pay. Whereas I can't imagine tenants really think like, oh, £365, is that a consideration to make here? But under the guise of the scheme, everybody has to be treated equally, whether you are Highland Spring, who are producing or bottling 500 million litres of water a year, or the guys out in Paisley who are making a craft soda company. Like, the scales of economy here are massive when you actually have to start and sit and think about the differences of who's covered under all of this. And I'm still only thinking about it as a producer. I can't even imagine start looking at like the retailing side of this or hospitality, like the extra headaches that come after that.
Jess, you brought up a really good point yesterday, which was that we get asked as producers to keep tabs on our retailers. So Matt would have to, if I was selling beer to Matt, I would have to get Matt to tell me how much Brewcavern are selling of my beer and what percentage to Scotland. I mean, and how much time, how many products do you have, Matt? How many different people?
So at any one time, we probably stock between 100 and 200 lines. It can sometimes go a bit more than that, but that's currently what we have. From, I guess, around sort of 50 to 60 different makers and producers at any one time. Because equally, as the brewery or the producer, you've got to check that the retailer, what the retailer's doing and how much of your product they're selling. We've got to keep tabs on where that beer goes and the customers that are receiving it and whether deposits are being claimed. So there's extra little admin links all along the chain. And what legal obligation do we have there? Do we have to submit a spreadsheet once a month or a quarter to show what's been going on? I mean, again, these are the questions that people have, and there are a multitude of avenues that just don't seem to have been thought through.
I think looking at the comments here again, Jamie got up, it's employed in many countries around the world. Yeah, it is. And nobody's disputing or arguing the fact that the deposit return scheme is necessary to get to where we want to be with net zero. As how it's introduced, you look at, all these different countries that have DRS or RDM. They started, as Jess said earlier on, started small and then worked into doing things. And now it becomes just part of their heritage, if you like. It's bred into the people. When I was at school, you were taught litter picking, and you went out at lunchtime, you did your litter picking, and it still sticks with you now. You get taught how to ride a bike, how to cross the road, green cross, go, all that kind of stuff. It's the consumer, that obviously they're saying that the producer or the polluter is the person that pays, but actually, if you look along the highways and the roads and the hedgerows, it's plastic, it's it's takeaway cups, it's all that kind of stuff. It's not glass bottles, etc. I could have accepted this scheme more if it had been started off smaller, whether it be plastics, which was the big thing, single-use plastics, etc. Plastic bottles, maybe cans, I could get that. But to add glass into it as a one whole altogether is just hard. And consumers don't understand, this is the education piece of it. I've had one meeting over this with Ornis later because she's just not wanting to engage, And I think it's important that the consumer gets the education that they need, because until the consumer actually stops. Is this going to be a case of it's only 20 pence, and the whole thing goes, and the profit then for those cans that don't go back into the system goes to CSL, who are a non-profit making company. So what happens if it just becomes the norm and people just don't go back and collect it? Is there a way of actually changing it where, maybe the producer pay and then the consumer gets the money back and the people in the middle are left out? I don't know. Is there a way that can be changed where, it's costed in around where the money goes to local governments and local authorities to better improve the curbside recycling instead of going to the CSL system? It's all about buy-in from everybody, from producer right the way down to consumer. And they haven't done the consumer piece yet because they don't want the consumer stockpiling. And that's the issue. And for us complaining about it, it's not a complaint because we just want to say we're complaining. It's because of the back end and the back office work that goes behind this without passing that cost on to the consumer.
Yeah. And, one of the other things is my gosh, we have taken an absolute beating during lockdown as a business. And we're still recovering. I mean,
we had the silly music ban. You didn't have that there in England, though.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds. I know there's other businesses that I know. One guy said, "Oh, how much do you lose?" I was like, I think we're on track for losing £300,000 in money, not to mention loss of sales. And he was like, "Wow, that's really good." And he said, "I lost 3 million." I was like, wow, okay. So we've all taken an absolute beating. And one of the things is we're all coming out of that period. We've all got, most companies have picked up some debt along the way. And we've got new bills to pay. And they, one of the things when from a business point of view, when you expand anything from where it was, you run out of cash flow. Cash flow is your main thing that you can expand a business. So many businesses go bust because they don't have cash flow. So one of the things that this scheme wants is money up front. It wants those 20p's up front. And so to me, that money, I might as well just burn it because it's not making me any money whatsoever.
You're lending on
what's happening?
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, what's happening with that 20p? All those 20p's that are sat with the Scottish government, there'll be millions and millions and millions and millions in an account. Who's making? They'll be making interest hand over fist on that. What are they using the money for?
Well, I think the money goes to CSL, doesn't it? Just doesn't go to government. I think that's the first point. And I think that's really no. And I'm saying non-profit making. So if they make a profit at the end of the year, where does that profit go? They say it goes back into producers' fees to try and reduce the fee, but does it mean that every year there's actually a wage review or whatever? Nobody actually knows. And from a hospitality point of view, cash flow for us is, horrendous for this scheme because we're having to pay it out when we order and we don't get it back in until not whenever the customer buys it, but whenever the consumer buys it, but whenever CSL decide to give us that money back. Now, if there's a breakdown in the communications or a system where, we don't get money back, that's money that's lost. So it's not just the cash flow as far as buying the stock. You've also got the issue where credit terms for businesses who are wholesale, looking at the consumer going, or at businesses like mine or whoever, in the license sector, where they're saying, right, okay, you're 30 days in a month. Really, the accountant's saying, but we can't be affording all that money out. What happens if their cash flow is not great? So the cash flow then becomes, or credit terms become 30 days in a month, back to 30 days, back to 14 days. And for some businesses who are, on tinkering on the edge, it may well be that, the wholesaler is saying, well, actually, it's cash on order. Yeah. So what does that do for a cash flow business for anybody? It's horrendous.
Honestly. So my question is, Matt, you're going to lose 10% of your turnover just because of somebody else's rule?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, where I'm at the moment is, the idea that a Scottish scheme can run independently just seems ludicrous. Pause it, allow, because I don't know if I've mentioned this already, but there are talks that a similar scheme will be coming in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland in 2025. The emphasis on the word similar, because there will inevitably be different rules. And what do you do then? You've got to label it for Wales, you've got to label it for England, you've got to label it for every different nation. And they're already talking about the fact that Wales won't be including glass, I believe. So again,
I think the whole English or the whole UK scheme that's being floated technically for 2025 will not include glass. So only in Scotland are we going for this like mega enforcement. I've seen today in one of the press releases that the UK scheme will be closely watching what Scotland are doing and learning from it, which makes me feel like they're just letting us take the hit up north and then being like, okay, well, so glass, that's ours. Let's just move big producers, not small guys. Like, I feel like it's a handy little skirt round, but you're right, because we're going to end up with this totally fractured scheme where now the people who are making loads of money are going to be the label makers, because I have to order 6 types of labels for one product. Like, there is a very serious consideration that we as a company are still chewing over, is whether or not we just stop trading in the UK full stop. Like Scotland, but UK, because if I sell to the big whiskey retailers are based in London, well, they're still going to have to register for part of the scheme. So maybe my company becomes an export-only company. It seems like a slightly daft consideration, but ultimately the amount of admin and extra paper it's going to cost us. We're working on tight margins too. Like, where does that go from? It's really... It's quite easy, I think, to start spiraling, or it's for me anyway, when I start reading all of these things and I'm like, right, fine, I'll only sell in Timbuktu. That's the answer. That's
I may be wrong here, Jess, but I think Wales are including glass.
All right, okay.
So, but I think whenever the consultation goes wider for, across in England, it may well be because Wales has such a high rate of recycling of glass already. I think they're up around 90% or something like that already. So they're phenomenal in what they do with curbside recycling and business recycling. So I think they will probably, if the lobbyists are right and they continue to do their job, Wales may well come out of that glass as well, where they'll become England, Wales, Northern Ireland will be just aluminium and PET. Again, separate.
It is coming from the idea that in Scotland especially, but across the whole of the UK, we have a really high percentage of recycling done through having fantastic curbside collections, which when some of these other DRS schemes were introduced, those kind of curbside collections didn't exist in those countries for a whole load of logistics reasons or whatever. But in the UK, it is about retraining consumers. We're talking about, like, I recycle. I have 4, as John will have heard me mention yesterday, I have 4 bins outside my flat, that I split all of my waste across different types of recycling schemes. It's a lot of consideration that there is still going to be articles that can't be put back on a deposit. So like my pesto jars or, anything that comes in glass that doesn't have a deposit on it, that glass bin will still have to exist to take away those. And there are already different councils talking about eradicating curbside collection and making it so that you'll have to take all of your recycling to central points and then split to curbside, or the things that were traditionally curbside. So like, the household jam jars, that kind of thing, and then deposit items to go to a separate thing. Like, it seems it's a very heavy onus to place on consumers, of which we can already see everywhere you drive in the UK, a large amount of whom can't be asked to put litter in a bin.
Well, I mean, this is the other thing. The other side to it is you could have a council like mine, which is Kirklees, which doesn't give a toss about recycling in the slightest, and gives you a recycle bin and a grey bin. And there's a whole list of things that you can't put in a recycle bin, like glass. And you can't put this in, and you can't put that in. And all those packets that I get, if they've got a recycle mark on, I put them in. But apparently, last year, they employed people to go around and check people's recycling bins. And if you didn't have the right things in, they took your recycling bin off you, because that's a really good idea.
Yeah,
that's really what they do in Japan. You have to write your name and address. They very heavily sort their recycling, and you have to have your name and address on the bags with the contents in, so that if you're doing it wrong, somebody will come to your house and re-educate you on how to recycle. I mean, even the idea of, like Steve said about bagging and tagging, is that recyclable plastic bags that we're putting it into? Does that not seem counterintuitive to be putting all our glass into plastic bags, which I would bet a whole pound that they're probably not recyclable and certainly not made in the UK, and are certainly adding to carbon costs.
The good bit is with Kirklees, everything that they don't recycle, they've got a massive incinerator in the middle of the town, which they just burn it all in.
Lovely.
Which
Good.
all that energy goes nowhere as well. It's not harnessed to the grid or anything. It's ridiculous. Honestly, our council, when it comes to recycling, is dire. You go just over the hill into Halifax, they do it properly. I don't understand what the problem is. But, I mean, we're going a whole different direction. It's just me having a rant at the council at this point. But, yeah, go for it. What were you going to say? You literally pointed as if you were going to say something.
I'm just going to say this. I've got to go. I've got something else. I need to go to another meeting at 2:30. But listen, please drop me an email or anything if you want me to join any of these again, because I think as we go through this towards the live date, it's going to be massive, and there's going to be so much more to talk about. And looking at the comments there today, from both brewers and consumers and things like that, there is a big education piece, and I think things like this here, and thanks for the invite, John, things like this here are really important. We can get together, and at the same time, outsiders can watch and see what is actually going on and why there's all this hassle and why are we making a big noise about it. But anything at all, please feel free to get in touch, and I'm more than happy to. And Jess, I'm sure we'll meet again as well, but on our groups and things like that. But please feel free to get in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you ever so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And
good luck.
Yeah, good luck, mate. Bless you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So, well, where do we go from here then? So one of the things I put on here, oh yeah, by the way, I didn't say this earlier. I put the press release in a Drive folder, which anyone can access. So there's a link in chat, so you can just grab that. It's not a problem at all. If you can't get into it, please tell me, because as much as I look like I know about tech, I don't really know about tech. So I'm just going to go through these. What's the cost for the business? I mean, we kind of went over this, but in layman's terms, you're talking 365 quid for every business, doesn't matter what it is. Matt, it'll be potentially more for you as well, because you've got to then re-register as a producer, which has more legal complexities to it than a retailer really should need anyway. Does that you'll have an AWRS anyway, won't you? Or do you? Yeah, you've got one of them. So, but I feel like that's going to bring a whole world of problems. So, what have you put a cost to what you think it will cost you, Matt?
No, so I actually contacted Circ a few weeks ago just to say, look, what are our obligations as a retailer and importer? And I got a one-line email in reply saying, you need to register as a retailer and a producer, and that was it. Follow this link, work it out for yourself. They can't even bother to copy and paste some text to say, these are your obligations. So if that's their attitude towards it, then frankly, no, I'm not going to put time into trying to work out what it costs me. I already know it's going to cost me more than I think is feasible. Certainly if we're talking about redesigning a website and, of other associated admin costs. I know it's going to be, certainly initially, we're probably talking into the thousands, at least over £1,000. I'm more concerned with the ongoing admin and costs that come with it, and actually the wider thing, like if we sort of think about what we're actually doing this for, is any of this actually going to increase recycling rates? Is any of this actually going to help the environment? We're talking about extra journeys, micro journeys for people taking a boot full of cans to the nearest vending machine, talking about potential for multiple label options being printed potentially unnecessarily if they never get used. I can't see how any of this actually solves a problem, if a problem even exists, when, as we've touched on briefly a moment ago, curbside pickup in most regions already exists. So
yeah, and I've seen it. And I was going to say the curbside collection, but also within the trade, there was a figure floated that hospitality managed to do a 92% recycle of glass already. So that's already 2% higher than the scheme is aiming for. I think across the board on a domestic level, I think they're aiming for, well, across the whole scheme, they're looking for a 90% return. Yeah, Botswana. They're looking for a 90% return. But I think in the UK, or in Scotland anyway, we manage about 85%. This seems like a huge undertaking for an additional 5% for, I mean, like, it's very different for me here in Glasgow in the centre of Scotland where the return units are going to be. But what about people on Shetland or on Islay, which is, famously home of the whiskey? Like, all of this has to be brought back on land. Are we looking at electric vehicles to move this about? These huge depots that they're talking about, and you'll hear Lorna Slater repeat about, the hubs being created, vehicles are being ordered. Like, the whole thing just sounds so vague that I can't. I'm really struggling. I really want this to be a successful implementation, although that makes me sound like a politician saying it. I just can't see in the current guise that it is, and the lack of support for small producers. I can't see the returns working here.
I just think it's madness. It's just really, it's a really great idea. I'm all for recycling. I think we all said that. It's just, we need to be united on this one, unfortunately. And the fact that it's used as a political tool is well, somebody on Twitter yesterday had a massive go at me, asking me, what is it that you don't understand? And then it said, give me 5 reasons why this is a mess. So I gave them 11 reasons why it's a mess. So, but the problem is that I understand it from their point of view as well, because they don't understand that, when I'm a mechanic by trade, that's my background. And I ended up with a brewery. And I learned everything that I know today by YouTube, people in the trade, talking to people, everything, like any way of getting information. That's how I learned it. And there's so much stuff that I would never have known had I just been a consumer, just no idea. And so when the consumer comes on, and you can tell quite often so I don't understand, or I know it sounds really awful, and I'm sorry if you're in Scotland. I don't care about your politics. I'm not interested. I'm not interested in our politics in the UK, in England. They all lie and disingenuous, and that's how I feel about it. But the problem is when they politicize something like this, and then they're using it as a tool, and it's our livelihood, it's our money, and without being precious about money, it's what our kids, it's my kids' sledges here, because we were going to put it back in the loft, but because there's meant to be more snow, we've kept it out. That's the money that bought them their sledge. So it's not just, I want a nice car, or I want a big house, or whatever. They're not playing with just that. They're playing with families. Ultimately, I have staff that work at the brewery. It affects their wage. There's so many things, and our trade has taken an absolute beating. So why do they feel that this is the good time to do it?
The good news is that this was actually meant to be implemented in July of last year, but they felt because of COVID and everybody recovering. So I'm not quite sure how in their head an additional 12 months means we're right back to everything being hunky-dory and sunny, especially when Scottish politics at the moment is really in turmoil. Obviously, there's a lot of political stuff going on. And like I've said, I'm trying really hard to make this not about politics. But when there's things like in Scottish Parliament last week, this was up for discussion, and again, is going live in about an hour's time. There'll be a further update demanded by the ministers. There was only one SNP Greens person present, and that was Lorna Slater, who absolutely, it's not hard to find the interviews with her. She's got like 12 lines and she just repeats them. You could play a really good game of bingo with them. She was the only person there, and yet when you look at the votes when they were recorded, the vote is heavily whipped. The whole of the SNP ministers backed her without being present, without hearing the debates, without hearing the arguments that were being made by people who have got real concerns being voiced. There was lots of businesses who have raised their concerns to their, respective representatives in Parliament. It's great to hear some of the businesses in Glasgow getting mentions made, and people down in the Borders where Steve is, there's some famous old breweries down there who are registering real concerns about how it's going to directly affect them. And they just kind of, okay, never mind. So it's going ahead 16th of August. And that's this thing that keeps getting repeated, that thing that you've shared right here. Yeah, 16th of August. Well, what about the fact that the producer deadline was meant to be midnight last night? I've seen it floated with a couple of letters from MPs that they're talking about the 30th of June, but that hasn't been confirmed. I think that's one of the things that's meant to be discussed today. So maybe by the end of the day, we'll go around and do this dance again until the 30th of June. You know, 2 weeks ago, I had kind of heard of this scheme and not really thought too hard about it. It wasn't until 1 week to the deadline, the government suddenly magicked up £22 million packages to help small businesses, even though they can't define what a small business or small producers are. They still haven't finalized the scheme. The producers agreement is being updated. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't sign an agreement if I knew next week it may have some addendums added into it.
Yeah.
When you're making a financial commitment every year, as well as the £365. Those UK-wide barcodes have a surcharge of 5% for this year. And at the end of year one, they'll look and see whether it needs to be adjusted up or down. So could be more if they think there's loads of fraud coming across the border. Could be less if they think fewer people are playing somebody in here called it return deposit bandits. Like, if there are fewer of those bandits than we anticipated.
Yeah, I'm trying to work.
And if
out
there's
how
loads of them,
many
maybe next year I'll be 8%, 10%. Who knows?
I'm trying to find out how many drinks manufacturers there are in the UK, but it's only either given me soft drinks or it's given me. I can't find anything reliable. It'd be interesting to see, because when they say that there's 650 companies that have signed up for it, I'd love to know if that's like Aldi and then every Aldi store in the area, like Lidl and every Lidl store in the area. You know what I mean? Like, what is
So
the 650 made
the
up of?
discussion groups that I have seen, some of them, there's a lot of discussion happening where there are people who are registering with Circularity Scotland, but are uploading details of some of their products, but are refusing to sign that producer agreement. So in my mind, they haven't signed up to the scheme, but they are registered with CSL. And I have a funny feeling CSL will take the bigger number. So that will include the people that have created that portal for their business and some of the details, but still are hedging their bets by not signing that producer agreement. I think they'll count that as a registered business, because otherwise I think that true figure would be lower again. I just 650 businesses out of an estimated 4,500 producers who were supposed to sign by midnight last night as an embarrassment. And I don't honestly know how Lorna Slater is still able to stand up and send out press releases saying 16th of August, come hell or high water, we're going to be there.
I got in contact with her office yesterday and asked for a statement, or I even invited her on here. I said, look, come and talk to us. I'm all about, I want to hear all sides of it. I mean, I'm annoyed with this, but I think the final piece to this is probably the three of us come up with some solutions. There's 2,426 breweries in the UK at the moment. That's just breweries. So it's not distillers, that's not soft drinks producers, that's not your protein drink guys, that's not your retailers, that is just breweries. So they haven't even got a decent number of them, I don't think. In the CBER WhatsApp group I'm on, I broke cover and just said, I'm not signing this. This is silly. I'll just not sell into Scotland for the time being, and we'll work out what happens. I think the same as you, Matt. That's really what's gonna happen. So, right. In conclusion, because we could rant all. Well, I certainly could rant all day.
I could do a week of this. I'm good.
Yeah,
and by
no
then,
problem.
we still wouldn't have any answers.
No, absolutely not. I put the banner up, but I need to take a comment down. That's the trick. So, what solutions could be brought forward? How could we find any solution to, like, I think my solution is really simple, and I'm massively simplifying. You'd think I was drinking, wouldn't you? Just wait until the whole UK. I think it has to be a UK-wide thing. I think otherwise we're in a position where there's just no point in doing it. It's so utterly complicated that I think we're in a position where there's no way forwards at this point.
I agree. I think, if enough businesses outside of Scotland decide not to sell into Scotland, then the impact on the Scottish economy presumably is going to be so significant that it renders the scheme harmful more than anything. I agree. I think make it a UK-wide scheme that's got another 2 years or more of ironing out the creases and answering the legitimate concerns that a varying array of businesses have about the scheme in its current format. Because there's going to be problems with the rest of the UK scheme, I'm sure. And I think it's probably right. Whoever said that, if you were cynical about it, you'd say that they're sitting tight and letting Scotland make a mess of it so that they can do it differently. But we don't want it to be done differently. We want it to be done as a unified scheme that everyone's on the same page with, and then there's no problems about where it's going. It's just like, if you're selling in the UK, this is how it works. So that for me is a huge solution to the problem. The other one being can we have some kind of transparency about money that's been spent already on this and where that money's gone, and ultimately what impact is it going to have for recycling and the environment? Because if you can't justify it on those simple terms, you're asking businesses to sign up to something that has no purpose, no cause. It's just, you've got to do this, and then obviously cynics, myself included, are just going to say, well, that's stealth tax and nothing more.
Yeah,
well, that's where I'm from. Yeah, go for it.
I don't think there's a look of it being a stealth tax. I certainly think initially the Scotland thing needs to be suspended until we could create a harmonized with the UK. But the cynic in me knows that the figures that are being floated about, even the small figures that we're seeing, the Circularity Scotland are supposed to have raised £100 million worth of revenue somewhere, or the fund has created 80 million of which comes from BIFA. So if we cancel this tomorrow, BIFA are going to turn around and be like, yes, so we want that money back. Circularity Scotland are on the hook for £18 million, which were all done through, there's 2 chunks of 9 million, which are loans, which only become liable once the scheme goes live. Even the IT infrastructure who have created this scheme that I have yet to see, apparently they will not be paid a penny until the scheme goes live. So I can imagine those parties are not going to be particularly keen for the scheme to be postponed to 2025. But if in an ideal world we could do that and we could work together as the whole of the UK, which politically we could create an entire scheme, I would like to see glass taken out of that as a producer who bottles solely in glass. My items are not high-speed turnaround. I'm not asking people to buy whiskey this weekend and take it back to the shop and recycle on a Monday. People keep whiskey for months, years. I have no idea when those 20p's are going to come back to me. Certainly not the speed as I would expect for canned goods, like especially soft drinks, which are going to be a much faster turnaround. So I honestly think that wine and spirits should be excluded from the scheme, regardless of container. But I do think glass, which we have a great recycling figure already, should remain out of the scheme as well, in line with how other DRSs around the world were set up. I think it's absolutely insane that when you look at the bones of how this was created, not a single DRS in another country was consulted. How did you set it up? What did you do? Scotland has just gone ahead and ploughed to create this crazy scheme, which is going to heavily damage Scotland, but also businesses that are not in Scotland, and make them feel like Matt and you, well, I don't want to trade in Scotland. It's too messy. It's too complicated. It's not worth the trouble. So it's damaging Scotland as well as the whole of UK infrastructure. Like I just can't see the upside of this. The upside of this is maybe we get 8% more stuff recycled. And that's one of the reasons why there's this political is very difficult about independence, but it's one of the reasons that a petition has been made by various bodies to see whether or not an exemption was made for this scheme with Westminster. Basically, there's a complicated bit of legislation that means if you want to create something like this that could create transparency in business issues between our imaginary borders, then you have to apply for an exemption. And there are several politicians who have been caught lying, saying this exemption has been applied for. And when questions have been asked to Westminster, they're saying this hasn't been asked. So that's kind of the thing that Steve was talking about at the top of the show.
there was something
That's-
interesting that I read in the SEBA group, which was that one of the politicians in Westminster has kind of bent the truth a little bit there, because the process in which Scotland has to apply for that exemption doesn't require this particular bit of paperwork. So he said, oh no, they've not done that. But they're not, in the law, it shows that it's not required. But I think both parties, something's not quite right. So both parties are trying to push their thing, and ultimately they're probably both lying. That's my guess.
Yeah. And
I mean-
again, that's the problem with the politics of it. Ultimately, some people are telling porcupines somewhere, but the real turnout is all three of our businesses are being damaged as a result of it. And
Yeah.
so I don't care who's lying. I would just like all that to be, I don't even know how you would clean that up and focus on what's really important here, which is the businesses and people who are actually attached to this scheme at the end of the day. And a whole load of consumers who are completely confused why us three have spent an hour ranting on the internet when they're just going to take stuff back and maybe get 20p.
Well, this is the crazy bit. Brasco, he's one of the I'll probably get this wrong. British Beer Guild writers is put a unified scheme for the whole of the United Kingdom. Since when has the United Kingdom ever been united? Well, that's another debate. How will Scottish independence affect this or any future scheme? I mean,
that's worrying that I'm now here as the token Scot. Don't tell anyone I'm actually from Yorkshire.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But I mean, also Beer Fridge podcast. Big shout out to these guys. They're in Scotland as well.
Okay, phew. I have got backup. I think it's embarrassing. It's a source of potential embarrassment for Scotland, and the ramifications of it are long lasting. Like you said, businesses are still recovering. I'm still recovering from COVID. I'm a little guy, but even the big guys are feeling it a bit, and yet we're pushing ahead with this in a world where I'm kind of, at the end of the day, I sort of run out of words for it other than to just scream and be like, it still hasn't. I wake up every morning and be like, oh, it still hasn't gone away.
What I always feel like you're just starting to get things nice, and you think, yeah, that's right. Matt will have had an opposite problem to me, which is, so for me, all my sales just disappeared because predominantly cask and keg gone.
Yeah.
You guys would have gone mad because it's everything went into small pack and everybody wanted mail order. And now we're on an opposite path where that's picked back up for me. But obviously for you, Matt, it's going to be a little bit harder now because you're competing with supermarkets. And now they're like, oh, let's come up with this other new brilliant idea to make it even harder for everybody. And
yeah,
I feel for you, Matt. I really do. I think it's going to be, it's a shame that, losing 10% of your turnover just off some politician's whim of whatever they want to do.
I feel like everyone I speak to in the industry has spent the last, it's nearly 3 years now, basically fighting fires. Every other month, there's a different thing you've got to kind of deal with. It's like, can we just have some stability for a period of time, which is what businesses need to bounce back.
Yeah.
But no, let's throw in another complication.
Yeah.
I think,
and that's before we've even got to the subject of Brexit. And I've spent 18 months trying to get glass for a new product out of France. Global logistics is shut down, so I've got stuff in boats that can't make it. It's really wild, and that's thinking on a much bigger scale outside of the UK. Never mind outside of my window here in Glasgow. Never to you guys down south. We're not that far away, and yet it feels like worlds apart for this one problem.
Brexit's a perfect example of how changes to how things travel across borders make things problematic, and that's a huge political shift that affects every single business that deals in import-export. We're talking about one, in the grand scheme of things, one small change here that's already throwing up a myriad of other problems, and that's just one nation out of 5 deciding to do that. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, the chap's point about whether Scottish independence would change things. Yeah, probably, and probably for the worse. In some ways, it probably makes things easier because you end up in a import-export situation. So the rules that come with that possibly coincide with having a different scheme for Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. But you only have to look at Brexit to see how, going on a new path as a nation creates so many issues. And you can't look at this and go, well, the right people are going to manage that and it's going to run with smooth sailing.
Yep.
Just the fact that, I mean, the more I watch and the more I read, I just feel like Lorna Slater's like the puppet, that gets rolled out to seemingly answer questions that she then can't answer. But being cynical, if you look behind the scenes, you're like, well, what's actually going on? Who stands to make money from this? Because it ain't small producers and it isn't small retailers.
No, it certainly looks like that this is aimed at pushing, yet again, independent businesses out and bringing conglomerates and large businesses in because they've got the money. They're like, yeah, we'll throw a few million at that. Well, that's nothing to them. And
there is a very real fear that's. I've heard people talking in beer chats that maybe Scotland's beer scene will look more like the 70s and the 80s, where we just had Scottish and Newcastle and big brands, and there wasn't this love. Like, we've got an incredible beer scene here in Scotland, which is heavily under threat from this. I just can't imagine what it looks like. We've got so many, even in Glasgow, we've got so many amazing craft brewers making phenomenal beer, and how they're now looking down the sharp end of a barrel and just.
But we had that during COVID. We had the Small Brewery Coalition, which had no small breweries in it. They're all massive, with an email that goes to nowhere and a phone number that goes to nowhere. You ring it, it just goes boo. And basically, they were lobbying the government to basically small businesses, breweries like us, to get rid of our duty relief because we're a small producer. We don't make it as much, so there's not as much margin in it because our systems are smaller, and they're trying to take that off us so that they can have more duty relief for them because they're bigger. And then what will happen with that? Well, all the smaller ones that are already struggling are definitely going to go then because they definitely can't make it work, and then you're limited to even more. Well, it will be macro breweries that will then get bought out by bigger breweries. Yeah. And then all you'll have, it'll go back to the 80s, 70s and 80s, where you've got, Hofmeister Bear and Tennant's and Carling and Foster's and a handful of brands that are all, like, at one point, I'm sure that there was multiple lagers branded as different things. They're all the same lager. Because we wouldn't have known. We wouldn't have known because we weren't educated there. But I feel like it's all big business. It's always geared to those guys, and money talks, unfortunately. And that's what I feel like. I feel like this. I'd love to see the accounts of who's getting paid what in all of this, and that whole thing with Biffa stinks. Like,
it's the more you read into it, the more rotten that is. I just wanted to raise a good point that the Beer Fridge podcast have also raised another little wrinkle, which when we have finished dealing with these fun things with the recycling, is in Scotland there's a potential ban on the alcohol advertising, which is so we've got this recycling, banning advertising alcohol, and there is also a consultation paper at the moment to ban the sale of peat in Scotland, which is a bad news for anybody who likes smoky whiskey. So I feel like Scotland is almost starting to feel like we're trying to trade into a prohibition era with the regs that are trying to come at our industry. It's pretty frightening. And if you're a small brewer and you're not allowed to advertise, like, I've read this consultation paper, and I highly recommend everybody looking it up and responding if you can bear to answer the questions. There's a lot there. But they are talking about creating alcohol will be protected in the same way as when we walk into newsagents and you can't see cigarettes anymore because they're all covered over. They're trying to make that the same with alcohol. So having it all boarded up, you would have to walk in and be like, specifically know what Single Cask Nation have out this week, which would be very difficult because we also won't be allowed to advertise. So you'd have to read my mind, pick which bottle you want to buy, pay that with your 20p deposit, and go home. Like,
Well, but it's already started down here. On here, I know there's a reflection on it. This is a Praga race car, which is raced in the series, the Brick Car series, this last year and the year before. I know the driver, a guy called Jimmy Broadbent, who's another YouTuber, and I wanted to put the Lord's Brewing Co. logo on it, and I could have paid to put the logo on the car, and the series wouldn't let me. But they said, if you make a non-alcoholic beer, we'll put it. You can put it on.
Yeah,
I didn't want to.
and you can see that with the Six Nations Rugby. They've had to put Heineken Zero instead of Heineken because we've all been, and Guinness Zero, because we've all been totally fooled as to what that product is. We just added some zeros at the end, so we're all like, it's definitely not alcohol.
It's just, I mean, don't get me wrong. You only got to go to A&E on a Friday or a Saturday night, and you can see how much alcohol-driven problems there are. But I don't think necessarily that is going to work in the same way as it worked with cigarettes. I think the issue is the core issue is the person, whatever's going on in their life that's causing them to drink like that. That's the issue. You're fixing the end problem. So if you take alcohol away or you make it hard to go get alcohol, what are they going to do instead? They're going to
recycle all their cans responsibly.
Oh yeah, but this is a whole nother subject. So I feel like we could go on forever and ever. But I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop it here and say thank you, Jess. Thank you, Matt, and thank you everybody in chat. Thank you, Joey, over in Ohio, America, for my $4.20. I know what you're saying. Joey is a man of the bud out in his state. It's perfectly legal there. And thank you everybody for joining. Rasco, we've got Beer Fridge Podcast, thank you. Chaddy O, he's in America as well. And we've got Irish Craft Beer Guy Alan, the Lager Logs, Paul's Beer Reviews. There's loads of you on there. Window Beer Reviews with Thomas. I'm just going on and on. There's loads of people, Jamie C and the rest. Thank you all for joining us. And I think we're going to have to do a follow-up video. I think there's going to be a few more of these, I'm guessing. And we'll go on this journey together. Would you like to promote your business one more time? Tell people where they can find you. If there's any mods in, would you find the links and stick it in the chat? That would be superb. So, Jess.
So you can find me a Single Cask Nation across various UK retailers and the world. We have a podcast called One Nation Under Whiskey, which we split across. We do longer, very longer episodes as audio only podcasts, and then we have a section which we call Extra Extra, which we host here on YouTube, and that's like a half-hour romp. We call it a Type 35, but sometimes that's squidgy, through various drinks industry issues, which is how John found me because we started talking about this yesterday. But yeah, you can find me as Whiskey Jess on Instagram, and Single Cask Nation and One Nation Under Whiskey on all the various socials. That's my plug.
Awesome. And Matt, go for it.
Yeah, so I run and own Brew Cavern, which is a craft beer, fine cider, and natural wine shop in Nottingham, in England. And we've got a physical store, but you can also buy online from us at brewcavern.co.uk.
Wonderful. And look at that. Disco in chat is putting the links up as we speak. So,
legend.
What more can you want? Wonderful community. I love you all. And I know this has been a serious one. Normally, I'm just messing around drinking beer and being stupid. So this was very serious for everybody. So, the announcement is at 3:30. Somebody else said it's at 3:20. So I might even try and nick their stream and put it on here, but we'll have a go. I don't know if I get in trouble. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.